There are few things more foolish than expecting a massive government program to save much of anything at all, but one of those things is being surprised when it doesn't. Another one is prescribing even more government to fix it for next time, but that's exactly where we are with what the new chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, is describing as the biggest fleecing in American history, the biggest taxpayer theft of all time.
This pandemic spending will go down in history as the biggest theft of American tax dollars ever.
Yes, it turns out that results were poorer than expected, which is especially bad considering the expectations should have been zero. Even that would be a goal too ambitious, actually. The simple baseline of no harm done would be an achievement far too high for government capabilities. The postmortem on our massive corona cash dump is absolutely hideous, but I suppose there's something to be said for even conducting this exam at all. Nearly 3 years after we started cutting government checks in who cares quantities with little oversight to save us from the government overreach of lockdowns that caused this problem in the first place, it turns out that an unprecedented level of government spending translated to an unprecedented level of fraud and waste. The House Oversight Committee is examining the scale of that fraud and waste now that Republicans have taken control, with a first hearing on Wednesday for a briefing from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or PRAC, a government watchdog for all those coronabucks. In total, the federal government distributed about $5.5 trillion in so-called pandemic aid. Of course, whenever we're talking government money, it's always on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Often, it's even hard to say.
Over $1.2 billion.
But for comparison, that $5.5 trillion figure is nearly a quarter of our annual GDP, meaning we took a chunk of money comparable to the value of every single thing we produce in this country in 3 months' time and just dumped it into the economy with almost no strings attached. Our national debt is famously gigantic. This number is a sixth of it. All the national debt we've acquired in the entire history of our country, this monstrosity accounts for 1 out of every 6 of those dollars. This pandemic spending was largely responsible for increasing our national debt by 50% in just 5 years' time. The Iraq War and the Afghanistan War cost about $2 trillion each. In the latter case, over 2 decades' time. We exceeded both of those numbers and then some in just 2 years of coronabucks. Given the size and the speed of this money dump, it was never a question of whether there was fraud. It's just a question of how much. And the answer, of course, is a historically large number. Historically huge government spending comes with historically huge ripoffs and abuse. One is a necessary consequence of the other. They can't be separated. And when the numbers get this large, so too does the possible range of waste that you've paid for. The current estimation from the watchdog informing this committee is something between a half and a full $1 trillion.
By some estimates, $560 billion gone.
So we're talking over $1 trillion. It could be more.
The actual number, of course, nobody even knows. Asked at the hearing if these estimates could be accurate, the Comptroller General says the numbers are impossible to estimate. So apparently the only limit to government waste is your imagination. But assuming there is some degree of accuracy in this half to $1 trillion range, again, for comparison, these are numbers roughly equivalent to the entire federal budget from the 80s. The amount of money the government possibly wasted in loss to corona fraudsters is roughly the same as every dollar they used to spend at all. We have an entire budget worth of pure fraud at this point. Not accounting for inflation, of course, another number they've thrown out of whack. So how'd it happen? Well, in ways, it'd be better if there was some sophisticated crime ring that discovered some hidden flaw in the system and exploited it to their advantage. At least then, there'd be something clever or crafty to admire. But of course, that's not the case. Instead, it was largely just good old-fashioned lies on a scale that nobody could really check anyway. According to PRAC's analysis looking at more than 33 million government aid applications, almost 250,000 forms used, quote, ineligible Social Security numbers. And in many cases, that's not ineligible as in there's some flag on your number that excludes you from eligibility in the program. That's ineligible as in these numbers don't even exist. As in, the number was not issued by the government. It was quite literally just made up. So hey, big congratulations to all the guys who just redeployed the old tricks from junior high math class to spell out boobies or asshole to cash in on the numbers that nobody bothered to check. But worse still, those ineligible for legal reasons apparently had no trouble collecting either. Make it up? Doesn't matter. Be legally ineligible for government payout still doesn't matter. The Treasury maintains a so-called do not pay list. These are people convicted of fraud crimes, people who owe child support or back taxes or other debts. That do not pay list was never cross-referenced through the Small Business Administration cutting these checks. So thousands of already known fraudsters got money, no questions asked. And plenty of them didn't even bother hiding it. They couldn't even be discreet and just settle for a nice, modest Unabomber cabin in the woods. In many cases, they spent the money on flashy, speedy cars or other luxuries. One guy even bought his own Epstein Island.
Patrick Walsh, a blimp company owner who used stolen money to buy an island in the Gulf of Mexico, and a Florida man who used $1 million in fraudulent cash to buy a Mercedes SUV, jewelry, hotel, and travel expenses.
And of course, a lot of the money just went to businesses it shouldn't have, big publicly traded companies, which were supposed to be ineligible for certain relief money, simply presented as smaller subsidiaries to cash in anyway. It's amazing how just a little more paperwork on top of the government's already unmanageable paper pile can easily evade their rules. But hey, at least those ripoffs were in-house. With many other applications, we couldn't even keep the money in our own country. We couldn't even keep the money away from foreign enemies, actually.
Who stole it? Investigators say cyber criminals, organized crime, Russian, Nigerian, and Chinese syndicates.
In fact, just one Nigerian guy swiped $500,000 from the US government and used the money to buy jewelry and a throne from which to laugh at us. Now, in fairness, that guy actually did go to prison, but the point is, our government showed no better security than your grandma giving out her credit card information over email because she's trying to claim some foreign fortune in West Africa. So sure, that guy may have been dethroned, but there are likely hundreds or thousands more Nigerian princes still throne-sitting comfortably. Oh, but that's just a small number of outlier cases. No, it is not. If 10% of the money that we spent was fraudulent, and it potentially is, according to the watchdog group, $500 billion out of $5 trillion, well, then it's reasonable to assume that 10% of the loan applications were fraudulent. There were 11.4 million Paycheck Protection Program loans in total, meaning it's reasonable to assume something like 1.1 million of the applications were fraudulent. And just how many of these fraudsters have we actually caught? About 1,000.
So far, just 1,000 people have been convicted of COVID-related fraud.
Meaning we are closing in on 0.01% of them. 1 in every 10,000 fraudsters will face the justice they deserve. Now, as far as the other 9,999, of course, we are going to need still more massive government spending to track them down. The lingering defense of all of this waste generally follows the logic of the vaccine. Sure, there are some concerns, but imagine how bad things would be if we didn't do it. We had to accept some fraud to achieve the greater good.
There was a real effort, as you'll remember, to get the money out and to get it out quickly. And there was almost a view that there would be fraud, there would be waste and abuse and other things. And that was almost, I hate to say it, the cost of doing business, that if you wanted to actually get the money out to as many Americans as quickly as we did, speed over everything else was the point, but that was the right way to do it.
Was it the right way to do it, though? What exactly did we achieve? According to the coverage, there were 3 primary goals for the coronabucks.
$5 trillion in COVID rescue programs to save jobs, keep families fed, and businesses open.
To the first goal, to save jobs, you will commonly hear now that we have recovered all the jobs lost to the pandemic, but that's not a complete presentation of the story. Nationally, overall, jobs have recovered, but there was a massive shift in where these jobs are. New York lost over 300,000 jobs. Ohio and Pennsylvania lost over 100,000 each, while states like Texas and Florida scooped them all up. Now, of course, I'm not saying that people freely choosing to live elsewhere is a problem. I'm saying that this drastic shift is a product of government meddling. It's an artificial shift that artificially benefited some places while artificially punishing others. And these jobs numbers are something of a mirage anyway. Just because jobs are available does not mean people are filling them, or working for that matter. Our labor force participation rate, the measure of people working compared to the population overall, is still well below where it was in late 2019. Back then, 63.3% of our eligible workforce was working. Now, it is 62.4%, hovering stagnant for the last year. 1% may not sound like much, but in the context of a workforce of over 160 million people, that's in the neighborhood of 2 million fewer people working today than there were in 2019. That is a bad number. But we're supposed to take comfort in believing that it would somehow be way worse if the government hadn't cut all those checks. The latter two claims are even more laughable. We did this to keep families fed. Never mind that food inflation has skyrocketed so aggressively, we're now smuggling eggs from Mexico. But hey, at least they kept the businesses open to display all of their poorly stocked shelves. They tell us to be thankful for hundreds of thousands of businesses permanently closed, on the basis that if it wasn't for their heroism, it'd be a few 100,000 more. Is there any serious belief that this unmonitored pile of money actually produced more good than harm? Are we actually supposed to believe that the biggest fleecing in American history, the biggest theft from our wallets in American history, was the best option that we had available? Does anybody honestly believe that if we left the risk assessment up to the individual and the states, that we would have had some massively larger body count or an economic situation worse than current? In other words, literally nothing from the federal government would have almost certainly been the preferable choice. Now, I agree with the characterization that this is the biggest fraud ever numerically by the dollar figure, but the truth is it was already the biggest fraud ever before a single check was ever cut. It was the biggest fraud ever in concept. The idea that the government can simply pay you not to work without serious or devastating consequences is pure fraud. If that premise were true, why wouldn't we do that all the time? Surrender your livelihood in exchange for government security was a fraudulent bargain in the first place. Even if nobody lied on the application for that deal, it was still a fraud in its premise. The government cannot simply wave a magic wand to create value from nothing. It never has been able to, and predictably, it was not able to this time. And yet, the conclusion appears not to be, let's not have the government ever even attempt to do any of this again. Instead, the conclusion is, what else? More government. We didn't have quite enough government this time around, so maybe next time, let's try just a little more government oversight.
Today, Republicans blamed Democrats for the lack of oversight.
And every American should be outraged, and they should demand that Congress do something about it.
Democrats blamed Republicans.
The Trump administration regularly told agencies to ignore data reporting requirements.
Both sides are demanding more oversight going forward, but getting much of the stolen money back now is highly unlikely. It's your money and mine.
But the lesson here is not just a few more watchdogs. The lesson is have nothing for the dogs to watch. Don't keep writing. Just hit the delete key instead. Oh, but we were just trying to help. We just got a little too ambitious with such a huge scale problem. That's all. No, nothing makes even the worst problems worse like a little government oversight from politicians and bureaucrats who are personally invested in the problem sustaining because that's how they earn their checks. No problem means no politician necessary to solve it, and they can't have that. The real problem is believing that they can, or that they even want to, of course. I'm less interested in the contest of who did and did not understand that lesson clearly from the start, and more interested in making sure that we take the opportunity to learn that lesson now, while it's still on sale for the low, low price of only $5 trillion.
The
9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Better late than never, perhaps, but certainly not a lesson better learned for trillions when it could have been and should have been absolutely free of charge. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.